waking to the sound of silent cracks fissuring beneath the marble, the weight of golden statues, like gods, imposing their own will. Each sculpture, carved in the likeness of a man who believed himself to be the embodiment of divine power. The year is 39 AD, and you stand as a ghost in the glorious, yet terrifying, Roman Senate. Watching from the dark corners of the Palatine Hill, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, prepares to exact another life for the crime of insufficient worship. The cold morning air carries the metallic scent of senators' fierce sweat. The heavy perfume clinging to the palace's purple silk walls is suffocating. The young emperor, only 23, strokes the neck of his favorite horse, debating which of your colleagues will die next, as if playing a game. Your hands tremble, your very breath hushes, and with every step, you feel the shadow of death. Before we delve into these dark and forgotten tales of survival, if you enjoy learning the secret and terrifying sides of history, liking and subscribing will help us explore these cold secrets of the past together. Also, sharing in the comments where you listen to this story from will connect us on this dark journey that transcends time and space. When Caligula rose to power in 37 AD, he carried the expectations of the entire empire on his shoulders. Born in 12 AD to General Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, he spent his childhood in the frontier outposts of the Roman legions. Soldiers affectionately dressed him in miniature boots, unaware that they would one day be praying for their own survival in the shadow of his future tyrannical reign. His first months in power painted a seemingly hopeful picture, but the whispers and hidden fears in the shadows would soon spill beyond the stone walls of the palace. While Caligula displayed the superficial kindnesses of an emperor once confined to governing laws and people, he was secretly building his own dark games deep within the palace. Political prisoners were released, elections were superficially revived, and generous gifts were distributed to the Praetorian Guard and the Roman people. Yet, this was merely the first hint of a storm brewing behind the young emperor's apparent mercy. Between the marble corridors of absolute power and the poisonous whispers of palace sycophants, the young man who once captivated the legions began to transform into something Rome had never seen before, a being who demanded worship like a god, but also indulged in the darkest desires of human nature. The first signs appeared in 38 AD, as he recovered from a mysterious illness. Palace servants noticed his eyes would lose focus for long minutes, his lips moving in silent conversation with unseen beings. When he emerged from his bedchamber, they saw that his eyes were no longer filled with calculation and reason, but with a restless paranoia and a sense of divine grandeur. The pale blue eyes, once full of plans and logic, now radiated a silent horror. Caligula's transformation first manifested in his relationship with religious rituals. Traditional Roman emperors ruled with a semblance of divine favor, but they avoided presenting themselves as gods. Caligula, however, shattered this thin line, as if in the exhilaration of a new discovery. The emperor ordered temples across the empire to replace the statues of traditional gods with his own. The heads of these statues could be changed with the seasons, so his divine image could be constantly renewed. In his private chambers, he built elaborate altars where he would have silent conversations with statues of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. Guards posted outside his rooms grew accustomed to these sounds, where the emperor's laughter was mixed with silence. It was as if divine voices only he could hear were sharing cosmic jokes about mortal affairs. The palace became a temple filled with the cold gleam of gold and purple, and Caligula ruled as a being who was both a god and a nightmare, whispering from the shadows at any moment. With every step, with every breath, the cold breath of death descended upon you, and the whispering shadows in the silent corners of the palace reminded you that the emperor, once a man, now lived only between his own madness and divinity. These religious innovations seeped into the most intimate areas, shocking even Rome's aristocracy, who were accustomed to years of scandal. Caligula established an imperial worship cult that forced senators and their wives to participate in dark ceremonies that blurred the lines between political obedience and sexual humiliation. In a documented ceremony in 39 AD, the wife of Senator Marcus Junius Brutus was forced to strip before a golden statue. The prayers she uttered were normally dedicated to Venus, the goddess of love and sexuality. The emperor's sexual desires were so intertwined with his power that governance had become an absurd theater. Caligula gathered the married women of prominent families in the palace in a rotation system of his own making. These women were forced to attend palace feasts, but their purpose was not conversation, it was exhibition. The selection criterion was not beauty, but the political importance of their husbands. The women were sometimes made to sit at his feet like pets, or forced to serve wine. Their husbands pretended not to notice their wives' humiliation. Marcus Lepidus, who was married to Caligula's sister Drusilla, was in a strange and uncomfortable position. The emperor and his brother-in-law would openly fondle his wife during state dinners, while simultaneously discussing tax policies and military campaigns. Roman historians recorded that Lepidus would stare fixedly at whoever was speaking about grain imports or Germanic tribal movements, his jaw muscles grinding like he was chewing on leather, while just a few feet away, his wife groaned and moaned at the emperor's touch. These dining performances served multiple functions in Caligula's psychological labyrinth. They showcased his absolute dominance over Rome's most powerful families and satisfied his need for an audience even in his most intimate moments. The palace was lit by the cold gleam of gold and purple, and the emperor ruled as a being who was both a god and a nightmare, whispering from the silent corners. Every glance, every touch, every moment of silence echoed in the dark corners of the palace. Death and humiliation weighed down every breath in these magnificent halls. And you, a mere observing shadow, held your breath in the midst of this spectacle of madness and power. The emperor could not find pleasure without openly displaying his dominance. Every touch, every glance, became a public manifestation of his imperial authority. These perverted desires took on an even more terrifying form in his relationships with his sisters. Roman sources, such as the historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, record that Caligula maintained incestuous relationships with his three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, but note that he dedicated his most intense affection to Drusilla. Drusilla died in 38 AD, likely from a fever, though some whispers claimed she had been poisoned. Caligula's reaction of grief horrified even Roman society, which was accustomed to imperial excesses. He declared Drusilla a goddess and established a cult in her honor, complete with temples and priests. But his mourning rituals went beyond classical deification. Palace servants recounted finding the emperor in Drusilla's old room, having long and detailed conversations with her clothes, jewelry, and even cosmetics. He would spend hours arranging and rearranging her belongings, recounting his daily life to these lifeless objects, as if waiting for a response, as if Drusilla were still there. Most disturbingly, his behavior before the funeral was documented. Sources writing decades later claim that Caligula delayed burying Drusilla and held private ceremonies. These rituals were a mixture of religious rites and necrophilic perversion. According to rumors, the emperor would anoint Drusilla's body with precious oils, read love poems, and political plans to her, accepting her death not as the end of their relationship, but as a new transformation. The palace had become a silent nightmare, filled with the cold gleam of gold and purple. And Caligula ruled as a being who was both a god and a shadow, whispering from the silent corners. Every movement, every laugh, and every whisper echoed through the palace's stone corridors. This place, where death, madness, and perversion converged, had become the stage for the emperor's dark desires. Servants and observers in the midst of this madness could only watch in silent terror and desperation. These intimate rituals with the dead also manifested in Caligula's treatment of his enemies. When it came to the deaths of his political rivals, the emperor went far beyond traditional execution protocols, demanding to be present and involved in their final moments. He would order the condemned to be brought to private rooms, watching and participating in their deaths, sometimes while the prisoners were partially or completely naked, and the right to kill, the ultimate expression of imperial power, merged with his sexual pleasure. A documented case from 40 AD concerns Senator Gnaeus Piso, who was accused of conspiracy. Instead of the traditional guillotine or forced suicide for the senatorial class, Caligula brought Piso to his private baths. In a room filled with the echo of steam and marble walls, adorned only with gold jewelry and a laurel wreath, he personally tortured and killed Piso. Witnesses recounted that the emperor alternated between inflicting pain and experiencing his own pleasure, as if the senator's screams and his own orgasms were part of the same ritual. His perception of death as an intimate experience also extended to gladiators and spectacles in the arena. Traditional emperors attended gladiator games as political theater, showcasing their power through control over life and death. Caligula, however, transformed these public arenas into an extension of his private desires and perverted pleasures. He would order certain gladiators to be brought to his private viewing box during a fight, where he would indulge his sexual excitement mixed with their blood and sweat just a few feet away. Caligula's most famous and dark innovation in the arena was the systematic humiliation of aristocratic Roman women. While professional female gladiators rarely fought, Caligula would force the wives and daughters of senators to fight against professional opponents, with minimal armor to expose their bodies and vulnerability. With every blow, every drop of blood, the dark pleasures of both the audience and the emperor converged. The arena was no longer just a battlefield but a stage for Caligula's perverse passions. During the fights in the arena, Caligula stood right beside the fear mixed with blood and sweat, feeling every breath of the gladiators, watching the horror in their eyes. Every fight was a spectacle that showcased his power and ruthless dominance, an intimate ritual of worship. This collection of perverted desires was further deepened by the complex and disturbing ceremonies organized around his horse, Incitatus. History remembers Caligula's threat to make his horse a consul, but in reality, his relationship with the animal was much darker and more perverted. Palace servants recounted marriage ceremonies organized between the emperor and Incitatus. Vows were exchanged in the ceremonies. The horse was carefully hand-fed during the wedding festivities, and Caligula would praise their eternal love, delivering long and passionate speeches. The ceremonies often ended with the emperor engaging in sexual acts in the horse's presence, as if Incitatus was a witness to his divine power and sexual passion. Caligula had complex sleeping quarters built next to the horse's stall. At night, he would lie curled up next to the animal, whispering state secrets, personal fears, and his most intimate thoughts, as if the horse were the only confidant he could trust. The foundation of these perverted behaviors was shaped by Caligula's childhood traumas and the impossible pressures of the empire. His father, Germanicus, died under suspicious circumstances when Caligula was only 7, likely poisoned by Tiberius's enemies. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was exiled for years and eventually imprisoned. Young Gaius was left alone and unprotected to face the deadly politics of the imperial palace. Tiberius, after the death of his parents, raised Caligula, but he himself was a ruler consumed by perversion and cruelty. He spent his final years in self-imposed exile on the Isle of Capri, surrounded by rumors of sexual perversion and cruelty. Young Caligula witnessed, and perhaps participated in, Tiberius's horrifying debaucheries. In these parties, children were used as sexual playthings, and lavish feasts were intertwined with systematic abuse. Every observation, every scream of pain, turned into a storm of passion and madness in Caligula's mind. These dark experiences transformed him into a person who was both an emperor and a figure of a nightmare, whispered to by dark desires. The palace had become a silent realm of terror, filled with the cold gleam of gold and purple, and Caligula ruled as a being who was both a god and a pervert in the shadows. Raised in the shadow of Tiberius, Caligula learned that absolute power meant complete freedom from the chains of morality and conscience. The old emperor encouraged his heirs to develop these perverted desires, seeing it as a natural expression of imperial rule. Young Caligula would watch as young slaves were tortured while he practiced speeches, establishing an unconscious link between power and the ability to inflict pain and humiliation. When he took power at the age of 24, he inherited not only the vast governing mechanism of Rome, but also the relationship between political authority and sexual dominance that had become normalized in the palace for decades. His innovations were built on the foundations of his predecessors, but their perverse intensity and creative madness showed that this was a genuine psychological necessity rather than mere political calculation. His marriage to Sonia in 39 AD offered the darkest glimpse into Caligula's intimate psychology. While his 3 previous marriages were short-lived political arrangements, the relationship with Sonia lasted until his assassination in 41 AD. Sonia was neither particularly beautiful nor well-connected, but sources record that she was exceptionally willing to participate in and encourage Caligula's most extreme and disturbing behaviors. Sonia assisted the emperor in designing and implementing the rituals used to humiliate aristocratic families, suggesting scenarios and minor details to heighten both the psychological torture of the victims and Caligula's perverted pleasures. Palace servants reported that Sonia often stood by during torture sessions, supporting the emperor with comments and encouragement. The wedding ceremonies were completely different from traditional Roman rituals. Violence and sexual gratification were intertwined, transforming the event into a complex spectacle that defined their relationship. In this ritual, which lasted for days, dozens of aristocratic families were forced to attend. Guests not only watched the ceremonial part, but also witnessed the physical consummation, which took place on a platform set up in the main courtyard of the palace, while senators and their wives stood in carefully arranged circles, unable to turn their eyes away. Sonia shone in this environment of orchestrated humiliation and public perversion. Every whisper, every scream, every scene of shame fed her and the emperor's dark desires, turning the palace into a nightmare and a theatrical space. Sonia was not just a spectator in Caligula's perverse world, but an active participant. She took genuine pleasure in wielding power through sexual humiliation over others. Each new victim was chosen at her suggestion, targeting women whose husbands had not been sufficiently submissive to the emperor's desires or men whose wealth made them suitable for entrapment. Their daughter Julia Drusilla, born in 39 AD, became a terrifying part of Caligula's ritualistic life. Even the brutal observers of the imperial palace were horrified by these perverted practices. The emperor held elaborate ceremonies to celebrate the baby's divine nature, taking the naked girl in his arms and declaring that she would be a goddess and his eternal companion. The ceremonies would end with Caligula engaging in sexual acts while holding his daughter, as if Drusilla's presence blessed and amplified his divine power. Palace servants reported finding elaborate altars built around the cradle where Caligula performed sexual worship for his daughter's supposed divine essence, alongside traditional prayers to Roman gods. Sculptors were forced to create statues of the emperor and the baby in horrifying poses, with Caligula paying large sums to ensure the sculptors did not reveal the truth. The emperor's behavior towards male palace officials and slaves revealed other dark rooms of his psychological labyrinth. While his relationships with women were based on dominance and humiliation, his bonds with certain men fulfilled different emotional needs. Caligula kept a rotating collection of young male slaves. These youths were both sexual partners and confidants with whom the emperor shared his most paranoid fantasies and grandiose delusions. These youths, bought at a young age and specially trained for imperial service, had a unique position in Caligula's dark world. Every glance, every whisper, every trembling breath was part of a dark playground in Caligula's palace. And Sonia, Drusilla, the young men, all were extras in this perverted symphony. The palace had turned into a labyrinth of silent fear and perversion amidst the cold gleam of gold and purple. Caligula ruled as a being who was both a god and a pervert among the shadows, continuing to silently terrify the souls of those who watched. They were at once the most trusted and most expendable people in the empire. They knew state secrets and personal confessions, but could be condemned to death at the slightest suspicion of betrayal or if they saw too much of the emperor's fragility. Marcus, a slave who served Caligula from a young age, and was with the emperor for nearly 2 years before his documented execution in 40 AD. Fragments of testimony preserved by palace servants give us a window into Caligula's private fears and obsessions. His fear of assassination, his belief that God spoke to him directly, his idea that sexual conquests were the purest form of political control, and his growing paranoia about the loyalty of those around him. Marcus's testimonies describe elaborate nocturnal rituals in which Caligula would disguise the young slave as various Roman gods, engage in sexual acts himself, and deliver long monologues about his divine nature and cosmic responsibilities. These sessions could last for hours, with Caligula alternating between intense sexual activity and philosophical conversations about power, divinity, and mortality. The emperor's fear of death manifested in detailed protective rituals combined with sexual activities. He would demand the presence of multiple partners during his most intimate moments, apparently believing that those who witnessed his power could ward off assassination attempts. These sessions were conducted in rooms surrounded by armed guards and lit by dozens of oil lamps, creating a paranoid atmosphere of sexuality for everyone present. Caligula's relationships with the Praetorian Guards revealed another aspect of his psychological needs. Unlike previous emperors who maintained a formal distance from the guards, Caligula regularly invited them into his intimate rituals. Apparently, he deemed it essential to have their physical protection present during his sexual activities. These guards, selected for their loyalty and discretion, were forced to witness and sometimes participate in scenarios that tested their professional coolness. Centurion Cassius Chaerea, the man who would later lead the conspiracy to kill Caligula, observed the emperor's private behavior for months and finally decided that death was the only solution to what he described as divine madness. According to his testimony, Caligula would make the guards stand as rigid as statues, indulging his sexual pleasures just a few feet away and displaying his divine presence before their eyes. The professional discipline of the guards prevented them from reacting to what they saw. Their silence became an echo of the emperor's power. These horrifying scenes served multiple purposes in Caligula's mind. He showcased his absolute power over men trained in violence, provided an audience for his sexual performances, and bound them to his service through a network of shared guilt and shame among the witnesses. The atrocities they saw with their own perverted eyes made them dare not betray him, because each was perilously close to death through their own complicity. Even the palace itself was a reflection of this dark mind. The boundaries between traditional state rooms and private intimacy were erased, and political meetings and sexual exhibitions were seamlessly intertwined. Guests expecting diplomatic negotiations could witness torture sessions, and intimate encounters could suddenly turn into discussions about trade agreements or military strategy. These spaces became a labyrinth that caused social rules to collapse, leaving senators and palace officials in constant anxiety and uncertainty. Caligula's obsession with theater and spectacle culminated in scenes where drama, politics, and sexuality converged. He would create scenarios about specific senators and their families, force them to play their roles, and watch and masturbate. These horrifying productions, which lasted for hours, with complex plots involving betrayal, humiliation, and compromise, fed the emperor's sexual excitement. Every moment, every whisper, every trembling breath turned into a theater of horror amidst the cold gleam of the palace's gold and purple. According to a documented scene, Senator Lucius Vitellius and his wife Plotia were forced to stage a dialogue about marital infidelity, slowly removing their disguises and engaging in sexual acts according to the stage directions meticulously set by Caligula. The emperor placed himself right in the middle of the scene, managing their performances and constantly commenting on their emotional realities and techniques while indulging his own pleasures before the eyes of the onlookers. These horrifying productions reveal Caligula's deep understanding of human psychology, forcing people to humiliate themselves and at the same time making it seem like a voluntary choice inflicted much deeper wounds than simple physical coercion. The victims, by staging their own humiliation, became both spectators and participants, active players in their own shame. Caligula's use of religious ceremonies demonstrates how sexuality permeated every corner of imperial authority. While Rome's traditional religious rituals emphasized community participation and shared worship of the gods, Caligula turned these sacred spaces into a spectacle for his own divine sexual presence. Participants were forced to worship him with acts that combined religious devotion and sexual service. In the Saturnia festival of 40 AD, the emperor had a massive temple complex built. Instead of traditional rituals, he introduced a worship order centered on his own sexual performance. Palace servants described the perverted ceremonies they witnessed inside and around the temple, accompanied by a trembling silence and fear. The whispers echoing amid the cold gleam of gold and purple reminded everyone that Caligula ruled as both a god and a perverted being. Citizens were forced to participate in Caligula's intimate worship, drawn into ritualized acts of submission. These acts were not limited to just prayers and offerings. They also included sexual services performed under the emperor's direct supervision. Caligula saw sexuality as the purest and most inviolable form of divine power. He believed that his ability to establish absolute dominion over the bodies and desires of others proved his divine authority. Traditional gods could rule over the air, war, or fertility, but only a living god like himself could demand absolute submission over sexual behavior. In his conversations with the palace's silent philosophers, he argued that sexual dominance was the purest form of political power, and an emperor who could force citizens to abandon their most fundamental moral barriers was entering the realm of divine command, beyond ordinary political power. The economic dimensions of these perverse rituals became a terrifying tool of pressure on Rome's aristocratic families. Beyond the shame of forced participation, the emperor demanded vast amounts of wealth to finance his increasingly magnificent sexual spectacles. Families were pushed to the brink of bankruptcy not only by taxes, but also by the costs of building private venues, procuring exotic stage props and costumes, and maintaining the emperor's collection of slaves and animals. Senator Gaius Scribonius Curio recorded that for a single evening's entertainment for Caligula, he spent the equivalent of several years' income to build a temporary amphitheater in his villa's gardens and force his daughter to engage in sexual acts with professional gladiators. These magnificent and terrifying scenes, combined with the immensity of their cost, both strengthened and cemented the psychological pressure exerted through sexual humiliation. The whispers echoing amid the cold light of the palace's gold and purple reminded everyone that Caligula ruled as both a god and a perverted authority. Every glance, every trembling breath, became a theater of horror etched into the souls of the onlookers. The emperor seemed to be completely free from shame and social criticism, so much so that he carried a temperament that modern observers might associate with extreme narcissistic personality disorder and possible temporal lobe epilepsy. His documented seizures, combined with his auditory and visual hallucinations, could suggest an organic deterioration in his mind, and that this disorder was fueling his increasingly obsessive and erratic behaviors. But Caligula's cruelties were not just the product of madness. Every planned torture, every humiliating ritual, was the product of a cold-blooded intelligence and a systematic sadism. His grasp of cause and effect was flawless. He displayed consistent behaviors in different times and places, showing a surprising creativity in devising new forms of humiliation. Every perverted act served both a psychological and a political purpose. On a gloomy day in 41 AD, the conspiracy that ended the emperor's reign was born at the peak of the psychological pressure building up on the Praetorian Guard officers. These officers had witnessed the emperor's most intimate perversions and had been subjected to mental torture by watching him for days. The leader of the conspiracy, Cassius Chaerea, stated in his testimony years later that the main purpose of the assassination was not political disagreement, but was triggered by the unbearable nature of observing the emperor's private behavior. The attack took place in a narrow and dark underground passage deep within the palace. This passage allowed for the emperor to be killed in a way that was separate from the witnesses who had become an integral part of his power and fear. The men who had witnessed his perverse rituals for months could no longer endure this horrifying theater of life. With every stab, death for them had become a release, and continuing to serve an unbearable nightmare. Even in the final moments of his reign, Caligula was alone. While no one could see his intimate perversions, this isolation was not a threat to him, but the security of acting like a watched god. But his reign, shaped by torture, humiliation, and obsessive sexual rituals, left behind a legacy of terror made of stone and marble. The palace, amidst the cold light of gold and purple, still carries his ghost, and the trembling shadows and whispering walls in every corner hide the echo of the emperor's perverted desires. On the horrifying morning of the assassination, the conspirators targeted not only Caligula, but two other figures from his intimate world, Sonia and their 20-month-old baby, Julia Drusilla. They had realized that the depravity created by the emperor's intimate rituals was too deep and contagious to be merely contained. This perversion had to be eradicated at its root. This systematic annihilation showed contemporary observers that Caligula's sexual perversions fundamentally threatened Roman civilization. The dark legacy of Caligula's intimate rituals was not limited to shaking politics. It presented the most extreme example of how human sexuality can be corrupted by absolute power. Intimate relationships had become terrifying theaters of dominance and control rather than love and connection. In a world where legal and social bonds were completely gone, the emperor did not hesitate to turn the human body and soul into a stage for cruelty and humiliation. Modern historians still debate the accuracy of ancient sources that recount Caligula's extreme behaviors. Some suggest that political enemies or later historians may have exaggerated these excesses for propaganda purposes. However, the consistency and detailed reports found in many independent sources suggest that the basic outlines of his intimate rituals are historically true. Perhaps some details were magnified over time, but the psychological patterns in Caligula's documented obsessive behaviors are still reappearing in contemporary contexts in individuals with unchecked absolute power. As we consider the conclusion, the links of this dark chain were broken only by death. Caligula's reign was buried on the stage of history with whispers and memories of horror echoing in every corner of the palace, amidst the cold shadows of gold and marble. However, his obsessions, his passion for pain and power, managed to reach our day as an unforgettable lesson about the dark depths of human nature. As the sun rises between the marble columns, tourists and historians walking through the ruins of Caligula's once gold and purple-adorned palace complex unknowingly pass through corridors where screams once echoed and tears flowed. These spaces, which had been the stage for the emperor's intimate desires and obsessive rituals, had their beauty transformed into a theater of cruelty. Caligula, who demanded to be worshipped as a living god, eventually died forgotten and alone. However, the psychological patterns that took shape in his soul still repeat when power is absolutely corrupted. Human dignity bows to political authority and personal desire. Cruel desires cross the boundaries of conscience. Corporate executives, military commanders, and political leaders all experience the same vicious cycle. Unlimited authority and isolation give birth to patterns of sexual abuse and psychological cruelty. The example of Caligula is not merely one of a pervert's momentary perversion. It is a cautionary tale that shows how human nature can be corrupted under extreme conditions and how power and desire can shape the human soul. In the shadows between the columns, in the silence that follows whispering prayers, the ghost of absolute power still whispers. Those who hold the power of life and death, sooner or later, fall into the clutches of desires that no moral boundary can restrain. And in every age, intimate desires shaped by power insidiously rise from the darkness. They make the human soul tremble and enslave even the most powerful. Caligula's forgotten shadow still roams the palace stones. He fixates his eyes on every shadow and twists his lips with every silent scream, reminding us of the human nature that is both horrifying and obsessive. His story is not just the fall of an emperor, but a dark psychological labyrinth where power, perversion, and desire converge.